All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome again, everyone. It's great to see the three of you that have been with us for a long time. This is our final session in our series, our 7-part series. And today's session is how do we bring it all together? Before we start, again, I just want to highlight that we will be offering simultaneous English and Spanish interpretation for today's session. In a moment, you will see the option to choose the language you would like to listen in and participate in today. Maybe, we'll see if we have the technology. This will show up as a small globe network. Also, we just wanted to make sure that you know that we are and will continue to record in Spanish and English, and that will be available at any time after the session. So I'd like to introduce our colleague, Lucia, from the Colorado Language Connection to explain more about how this works in Spanish.
Ok. Hola, buenos días a todos. La sesión de hoy va a ofrecer interpretación simultánea en español. Si quieren, pueden hacer clic en el icono del globo que está abajo de la pantalla y así pueden escuchar toda la presentación en español también hoy. Y también esta presentación va a ser grabada en español para que si quieren verla más en el futuro, todo será aquí en la página web.
All right, thank you so much, Lucia. And we do have the interpretation globe there at the bottom. We are enabling it now. If you would like to have this session in Spanish, you can click on it. Or if you have colleagues that would like to review this session in Spanish, again, it will be available through a recording. Once again, welcome to our Colorado Equity Compass Learning Series number 7. How do we bring it all together? The data, the stories, the visualizations in a clear, compelling, and equitable manner. And again, our hope and our intention today is that you will be participating with us. And since we're a small group, we hope that you will feel free to share as much as possible. On behalf of our colleagues, again, those that are here and those that are not here, Rochelle Espiritu, our managing partner, she's in a meeting in Washington, D.C. today. Myself, Scott Van Loo, and Alina Taniuchi are here. And then our colleague Eve is unable to be with us today too, but all of us contributed to this session today and to this series. So again, this is old hat for many of you. The Zoom group agreements, we love it if you stay on camera because let's face it, you're all really amazing, good-looking people, and we want to interact with you and see your faces. We would love for you to be an active participant in this session. We want to hear your thoughts and read your thoughts and ideas. That's what makes this such a special training. And then again, as we mentioned, live simultaneous Spanish and English interpretation. The session will be recorded and posted online. If you please send a private message to Alina here on with us if you would prefer your verbal or chat responses not to be recorded. In our agenda for today, we're going to understand strategies for visualizing data and stories. We're going to integrate ethical and equity considerations and visualization, talking about how to tell a compelling data story, determine effective and relevant platforms to share stories, and identify actions for health equity change using the above methods. So our community builder today is to find and share a visualization, like an infographic picture that you like. What impact does it have on you? So Alina, I wonder if you stop sharing, we can put that in the chat, or we can, because I'll model, I'll go first. I want to share my screen, but so one visualization that I like a lot, and I learned, excuse me, let me find it. I learned it through my time teaching students, is a website called VisuWords. It's V-I-S, let me find it. V-I-S-U-W-O-R-D-S. So it's visuwords.com. And what's really cool is I'll show you. Let me make sure we're following along here. Can you see the screen? The blank screen now? Okay, so you can put a word up here, like I'm going to put the word equity. and it'll put it here in the center, and it just starts making these connections, like a word map or this cool map. But then you can grab things and move it around, or you can hover over and it'll give you the definition. So you can kind of make it your own. It's like this big blobby definition kind of website. And you can see the map over here tells you the kind of connection to the original word. So it'll distinguish if it's a noun or a verb, the part of speech, and it'll also show you the strength of the connection. So it's a word for, like a synonym, verb group, etc. So anyway, I like this a lot. And then you can, like I said, you can reorganize it. You can even add to other words. You can, I think, you can even click on the word and give it different weights or move it. So anyway, that's the visualization I really like. Like, this was a game changer for me and for my students when I found it, because it's really interactive, and I love the visualization of it. So does anybody else have, coming back to our check-in question, our community builder, is there a particular visualization that you like, or you'd like to share? You verbalize it, or if you have it, you can tell us the site, or we could share it. But is there something that you can think of, a visualization that made an impact on you, or that you really like, and why?
I can share, since I know this is a little bit more of an involved community builder than we usually have. It might take some time to find something. So this is kind of a unusual one, but this is actually a quilt that my grandma made. So she was like a huge quilt maker. She probably made over 200 in her lifetime, and they take a long time. This is like ginormous. It fits over my entire bed, but this one was actually made from entirely from scraps that were given to her from friends and colleagues that she met over time in the quilting community. So each one kind of represents them and a point at which they came into her life. And I love how it's such a different form of visualization, but there's still data that's in it. There's still stories that comes with each one of these kind of little pieces of the quilt, of people that I've never met, but it just reminds me of the richness that it continues to be in data visualization. And I think it's a really interesting thing to kind of have this almost artifact, even if I can't make full meaning out of it myself. It's just a creative way that I thought was really interesting, that she incorporated data into quilts that she made.
All right, thank you. That's a cool story. How about Zach or Eric, Maria?
I don't have a picture of this, but I like when they take the photos of people and then they end up making like a collage of other people, like another person. I think that that's a really neat visualization of like humanity, really.
Yeah, I love that. I know exactly what you're talking about. Does everybody have a picture of that in your mind, that you've seen that before? Yeah. In fact, again, coming back to my experience in schools, there's like a photography company that was doing that with like the high school students' pictures. And they make a huge collage of either the school mascot or the year or whatever, but I love that too. That's good. Thank you, Maria. Zach or Eric?
Oh, I don't know if I've got anything super queued up, but I did just think of, we had, actually I've been thinking about this a lot because it was a little podcast we had almost going here in Durango about different neighborhoods and histories and displaced communities and stuff. And they did a presentation last year at this bookshop, and they had so many cool pictures of, like, from the 1940s, here's this neighborhood, and like, you know, now it's a water treatment facility. It was just neat to see, like, you could go find those same photo vantage points and like really compare to see like the difference there. And so not necessarily what I would think of for like this group and this thing, but I know that stuck with me is like, dude, I really want to see, I want so many more of these pictures. I want to slide back and forth. Like that is really, really appealing to me. And I want to see more of those. So I just thought of that one there.
Great, thank you.
That is really similar to what I had. I like the pictures over time where it's one picture over like every 5 years for 100 years. And I mean the untold story in those pictures of that change over time, I think is always really interesting to me. It really captures that the physical presence of it and kind of, I feel like leaves you with like a lot of questions of like, well, why did it change? Why is this different?
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. Zach and Maria, Eric, thank you. I do think all of your stories are very germane to what we're talking about today, very connected, because the whole point is the power of visualizations. So when we combine that with data and we combine that with the story, then you get the overall picture. So thank you. That's really, all of us had a really powerful moment from Alina's quilt that has the story behind it, but it immediately draws you in because it's an artistic piece, right? And then Zach and Eric, your stories, that draws you in because it's captivating. It almost creates a sense of awe, like, and wonder, right? And then same with Maria, like you have the faraway view of the picture, but then when you get close and get into the detail, it's a whole other thing. So all of those are great examples of how really strong visualizations can draw us in and create interest. So thank you for that. So that is a perfect transition into what we're going to be going over today. So this is really just a reminder slide that when we combine these elements, the right visuals and the narrative and the right data, and then that's what you have a data story, right? A compelling data story that can influence and drive change. And so our whole point of this 7-part series is that there are different entry points. You don't necessarily have to start with the visual, right? But if you do, and you have something really powerful that draws you in, then that can be your entry point. And then you can combine that with the narrative and with the data. And you can see those crossover points, how we can engage and explain and enlighten people with that intention of change, right? The end result being that we want to change something. So it might be like Maria's example. I love that because, again, when you change your perspective on that picture from far away, you can almost create anything, right? With the light and the dark. And then when you get in close and you see faces and you see people, that might be the hook, right? That engagement piece that then you could bring in the narrative and then you could bring in the data, which then would lead to that change, right? And then other points in time, we might start with the narrative or we might start with data and then work our way around these 3 elements also. So this is just a reminder that the best way for a data storytelling is to have all 3 of these components, and then to purposely think about what's your entry point for your audience, like what's going to be the hook that's going to bring them in for the other elements. Any questions or comments on this before I turn it over to Alina, who's going to share some more content with us? Okay, Alina.
Thanks, Scott. And there's just a quick quote that we have here around the best data visualization is the one that tells the story which needs to be told. So take the next few slides with, a grain of salt around there aren't really universal ways for how we should be explaining numbers with the visualizations, but make your data viz for the people who are your data. So again, bringing it back to the community that we've been talking about throughout this series is really at the heart of the data. It's where your data is coming from, and it's hopefully where the data will be used as well. And that's from Heather Kraus at We All Count. So this might look a little bit familiar. We've talked a bit about these in the past, ethical and equity considerations in all of our work. So these are just a few points to think about as we talk about visualizations before we get into the stories as a whole. So make sure that you're examining your data critically. It goes back to what we've talked about on who's included and who's excluded from the data, how's it collected and why, who benefits and harms and or is harmed by the data that has been collected. Those are really key in understanding too how we might visualize so that we can make sure to include empathy in the way that we are visualizing data and the way that we're presenting data. Think about whether you were one of the groups or not. Think about what it would be like to have this story told about them through a visualization, and how would that make you feel? It's something that's really important as we create visualizations. I think as we all kind of said, their visualizations have the ability to communicate so much more in such a quick amount of time. And so there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that as well. When we're talking about visualizing specific trends or groups of people, and making sure that we're not necessarily presenting the audience with unfair or snap judgments around the data, and making sure that we're kind of telling a fuller story with the visualizations. We want to be very mindful and respectful when using languages and labels in our visualizations. So one thing we talk about often in our work is people first language. So starting with the person, not necessarily the characteristic that that person we're describing that person with. So people with disabilities versus disabled, a person with asthma, or communities of color. Those are labeling people and not necessarily like the skin color themselves. So thinking Black people rather than just Black on its own. And remember that the language can evolve over time, and groups of people, labels that we prescribe to them in an attempt to kind of make our lives easier and quicker, those often change. So something you used before might not be acceptable anymore. But I think as long as we are open to and aware of making those adjustments over time, that's really important. You also want to think about using labels purposefully. You don't want to necessarily order the data just by the way that they're presented in terms of like historical biases, right? So oftentimes you will see groups being compared always to white, or women always compared to men, as almost like that is the standard as to which everything else is compared. And so making sure to create visualizations that are also getting to the point that you want to talk about. If you're speaking specifically about the experiences within one community, it's probably best to start with what is all of that data that they have. And if you need to or want to get into the disparities or equity issues that may exist, that can be important, but it doesn't always have to be so singular in that, you know, it's just Black versus white, Hispanic, Latino versus white. It can be multiple experiences between different groups that can help to explain farther the true nature of kind of where those disparities are happening. We also want to consider missing groups and how you're labeling those. We will oftentimes see, and even in the equity compass, we have mixed race or other for groups that we don't have enough data around, but we have a data limitations where we're talking about these are groups that, because of the nature of the data collection, there is not enough available information to report on. So sometimes it's really important to say, it's not that people are other or that they, not enough. It's like our methodologies were not sufficient enough to make sure that they were included, not that they don't count. It's a really key thing that folks continue to see the fact that they do count, and it's more on the onus of the data collector. So just be aware of what kind of labeling implications can have. Colors, icons, and shapes also have a lot of implications, both historical and current. So when we're talking about colors, be careful around reinforcing gender or racial stereotypes. Try to not use incremental colors like light to dark to represent different demographic groups. When you're using icons and shapes, recognize how readers might be able to better connect with data with small shapes or icons, but use them carefully. And then also avoid stereotypical, discriminatory, racist, misogynistic imagery. And use images that show people as empowered and dignified, not that are showing like victim necessarily. We've talked about that before too, when writing stories, to not just paint people as victims, but as multifaceted. And there's a lot of strength that comes in our communities as well. And then going back to the community, make sure to connect with them, communicate with the people and the communities of focus. You want to continue to build that trust that we've talked about prior, when we're asking them for their stories, when we're asking them to share their data. It's a really important thing too to say, does this visualization make sense for you? Does it reflect your lived experience? Does it look, is it understood by you? And would you think other people in your community as well? Because something that maybe in your frame of reference or in your experience makes sense might not necessarily make sense for others, and in communities that you're working with. And then also consider the needs of your audiences. As Scott said, there are different ways in which people enter into and resonate with parts of your story. So maybe someone who's a very visual learner will latch on to the visualizations, whereas others might resonate more with the narrative or stories that are told. But you also want to make sure that the visualizations themselves are speaking to community, not necessarily speaking down. But if you have an extremely complex table or graphic that is really difficult to understand, or it requires someone to sit with for a long time, that's not necessarily doing yourself service. It might be putting up barriers or causing more confusion around what you're trying to communicate. And then also consider translating your products if there are different languages that are used within communities. I know we worked with a community out in Fort Morgan, where I think there were kind of 5 predominant languages that were used, and all very distinct. And even within those, we wouldn't necessarily distribute Somali language on a sheet of paper, because their preferred, at least in this community, their preferred form of communication was very much verbal. So giving them a sheet of paper with the same information that you're maybe having translated in English and French wasn't going to work well within that community. So there are different ways at which we might approach that. And I think that is also a wonderful thing about visuals, is at a glance, things can feel a little bit more familiar, but there still might be a different approach in which you might need to share a visual. So you might not have as many labels, in Somali, but you might actually be explaining, this is what verbally, this is what these different aspects of visualization are. So those are just a couple of considerations as we're talking about visualizations. And as we shared earlier, visualizations can look very different across cultures and across what your data is actually wanting, like the story that it's wanting to tell. There is a whole history behind data visualization, as Rochelle mentioned, I think last time, going back to paintings on walls in caves. That's something that humans have used throughout time. And there are so many instances in which different cultures and different communities have used kind of what to them becomes universal symbols or universal ways of communicating. So you want to really honor a lot of that. This picture is a visualization. I think it's called a Kippus. Wherein those knots, this is an Incan data visualization, and those knots actually are communicating a point in time, and the way that the colors are kind of incorporated in those each mean different things, and how they're all connected as well. So it's a really interesting way that their community could communicate and understand, and was ways to visualize data that not necessarily is recognizable to us, but you can start to kind of see how they were able to communicate over time. And it's really important as we're talking about visualization to make sure that we are continuing to honor that community voice and what's understood in communities, because if their stories are told in the way that makes sense to them, and also to maybe additional audiences that you have, the impact and the way to carry that story forward kind of lives on. So think about your audience and make sure that the data viz that you're using is culturally relevant. You also want to think about ways in which your data visualization is kind of communicating what's missing or excluded. This isn't always possible, but we can think about things like data over time. So you might look at, I don't know, education rates within different communities, starting in the 1960s and what the trends have looked like there. But what happened before the 60s? Like, where was the education at prior to some really key points in time, like the civil rights movement, right? So like where were we at with our education, where you might be telling one story, but if you move the frame of reference out a little bit farther, it might tell something very different. And especially as you're visualizing data, as you're creating charts or trying out different methodologies for looking at the data in kind of a different way, it might bring up additional questions that you weren't necessarily expecting beforehand. And I think that's a wonderful thing about visualizing what the data is that you have, because you can start to see trends, or you can start to even notice what's missing. And then also thinking about each symbol or character as kind of their own color. So I like to think about, if we're telling a story where you're building kind of one visualization off of another, you don't necessarily want to introduce a group of people as one color, let's say, and then later on in your report, you have them as a totally different one. You want to have connections between the mind's eye and those kind of characters, as I'm saying, like those communities throughout time. So you don't want a group that's being used as green earlier on in the report within a bunch to be then later, turned to purple. It just doesn't make a lot of sense for our brains to make those connections between that being the same group. So these are just a few things. And then, accessibility is also important. So I'll have a resource in a couple of slides. There are a few different sources out there, but looking at what the contrast is between the different kind of elements that you're visualizing can be really important for folks who do have color blindness or who struggle with seeing those changes in colors. And then also thinking about colors as, does it make sense to do kind of a sliding scale, dark from light, as we talked about earlier, or should the colors be distinct from each other? So those are kind of some additional data visualization tips. Again, as we spoke earlier, there aren't any, this is exactly what you should use for this situation. These are a few charts that have been provided by Stephanie Evergreen. She's a great data visualizer and loves input from others for their creative ways that they've decided to visualize. Some of these you've probably seen before. They're the reason that a lot of these are usable across multiple situations and recognizable. But there's some that are really complex and a little bit more difficult to employ and do so well. You can visualize your data, but they're just some kind of jumping off points. And I really like the way that it's set up around, like, what is your story trying to tell? And then if you're looking at a hierarchy, looking at that, then what are some maybe suggested ways that you could visualize your data? So those are just a few options. I think there's also a really important aspect to humanizing our data. So a lot of these are kind of unrecognizable as humans, but like you're looking at a bar chart, that doesn't necessarily, to me, equate to the humanized part of the work. So there's an interesting visual that came from an Urban Institute kind of data visualization do no harm guide that I really liked. So it takes what kind of you saw in those other chart choosers around a stacked bar, to actually starting to break it out as people and starting to talk about, these aren't just like this section of a bar that kind of feels really stale or stiff, but it's actually people who are experiencing poverty that you are visualizing here. So it's kind of an interesting way to take what you could very easily map and just make it a little bit more human and start to build up that story, start to build those feelings that we get from stories by humanizing it. So these are just a few data visualization resources that we wanted to share. You can see that after each of them, I've kind of specified what some of them excel at, or what they kind of offer. We welcome you to check any of these out. There's always Excel, Google Charts, or Google Sheets that you can use to create visualizations as well. But there are some really powerful tools out there that are very user-friendly and user-driven. So welcome you to check any of those out as well. And we'll make sure that you all get these with the follow-up. So really quickly, these are, I think, items that all the folks who are on here today have seen, so I won't take too much time. But this is a review of some of the things that we've talked about in the past couple of sessions as we're building into this now, telling our stories. So bringing back in the data and the narrative in the next slide around what we've discussed before. So using a variety of data sources, that means looking at both qualitative and quantitative, maybe data that you've collected yourself and data that's existing already. Creating a data collection plan will help to keep you focused and reduce the burden that you have on your team, as well as those who you're collecting data from. Get creative with the data that you use, how you're collecting it, how you're making sense of it. And we encourage you to use the Equity Data Navigator that we have on the Colorado Equity Compass website. Does anyone need a refresher on that today? Because if not, we might skip doing that. But it's kind of like, if you go to the Colorado Equity Compass, you click on Equity Data Navigator, it's right there. You type in your county and you can click through to find data. You can see the ethical and equity considerations that we have here. just remember the limitations that pretty much any data collection process has. Remember to engage community members at every step in the process and check for biases throughout that process. We know it's not ever going to be bias free, but it's helpful to check yours and others, and address the contextual factors from historical and systemic racism so that we can move from doing no harm to adding value and doing with care. And then a narrative review, which is mostly from last week. We'll talk about doing gathering stories that kind of happens at the speed of the storyteller. So we talked about some best practices around interviews and kind of how to conduct those and get a story firsthand. We also talked about how a good story has character and emotion, and it also has structure. So we talked about kind of beginning, middle, and end. Be authentic as you're telling stories. It'll feel a lot more natural, and sticking to 2 to 3 key issues will make it easier for your audience to take action and really know what you're talking about. The Colorado Equity Compass does have a lot of social determinant of health related stories, so we welcome you to check those out if and when you're building your story to kind of have, as Scott had mentioned, a hopping off point. As we're talking about ethical and equity considerations, going back to that trust building and relationship building that happens over time. And that can also be reinforced by making sure that the narrators have continued control and consent and ownership over their stories. Honor the complexities of people, situations that come up in the stories. Narrators are the experts and they're multidimensional. And then also make sure that, as we've talked throughout all of these process, that the stories are accessible to those who are giving the stories to us to use and to share. Finally, before we go into small groups where we'll actually have you practice telling a story, whether you've been working on one throughout this process or are kind of starting at doing that today, we just wanted to do some applied learning right here. So this kind of expands upon the idea of the, beginning, middle, and end that we talked about during last session to tell a 5-beat story. I imagine everyone has probably seen this at some point in their life, but this is kind of what we're recommending as a hopping off point for our small group discussions today, where you will start to develop an actual storyline around an introduction, an incident. So that's an exciting event or the start of a journey, kind of the catalyst that sets things in motion. The rising action might introduce some obstacles or complications that a character or a community or policy maybe is encountering. The climax is kind of the main event where change happens, or where maybe your character chooses a specific path. And then the transformation is sort of the resolution or consequence or a change to view that maybe comes at the end of that. So with that, I need to pause on talking soon. So we will go over the document your data story. So again, I'll paste that link into the chat. And we can do a quick preview of that. Everyone on here today has joined us before, so I'm going to go ahead and skip over the how to make a copy of the full file. Let me share my screen. Okay. So on page or slide 8 here, you'll see that same kind of storyline that we had mentioned before. Is this? Oh, page 9. I was like, I definitely put this in here. Okay, so page 9, we have session 7, how to bring it all together. So that's the 5-beat story that we're talking about. There's like an incident, a rising action, climax, transformation. And you don't necessarily need to, have narrative and a data point and a visualization at each step in the story, but think about where might be the best point to introduce data. I think the introduction could be a really nice way to set the stage. You're kind of establishing the scene, you're establishing the ecosystem in which maybe a character is operating. And so maybe the introduction, you include kind of data point there. Maybe the rising action or the climax has a visualization around like what is the thing that is happening, what are the obstacles that folks are facing, or maybe the transformation, you kind of have the visualization of a community together or something along those lines. So we welcome you to be creative about this, about how to bring in the stories and the visualizations and the data into your story, but we'd love to actually ask you to create a little story here today during the small group discussions that I think Scott's going to do a quick little more introduction on before we let you all have some time to do work on that.
Great. Lena, did we want to take a stretch break or do we want to just go right into small group?
Stretch works. I know I could use one, but stretch works as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's take just 5 minutes and then we'll come back. So just before 10 till, if we can be back here by like 9:49, I think is what it would be. If you just take a few minutes. Thank you. And we'll see you back and then we'll get into small group.
Thanks, Scott.
Okay, so Maria and Zach and Eric will put you into a group, and as a group, you can decide, you'll have some time to just try to get into this storytelling process. And we would love it if you would use the Colorado Equity Compass and the Equity Data Navigator. And you can have these different entry points. So one would be that you create a story from scratch. So maybe Maria, Zach, or Eric, you have a story in mind from your community or something that you're thinking about, and you want to share it with the group. And then as a group, you can kind of create those 3 elements. So what visualization would you use, or what data would you gather, what narrative? Another option is to use an existing story from the Colorado Equity Compass. And you can, okay, thanks, Zach. You can take that story and then find some data and develop a visualization. So for example, I was looking up on the site, this group that's from Colorado Springs, from El Paso County, and they are called the, see, what are they called? They have a food bank down there. And so it took a little bit of searching, like I needed to, I found the story online and then I needed to look up their address, and then I found their census tract from that on our Equity Data Navigator on the site. And then I was able to start to get some data and combine it with the story that you can also find in our story section on the Colorado Equity Compass. And then the third and fourth points, again, if you think back to that visual with the circles, you can have any one of these. If you already have some data, then maybe think about, well, what's the story around it, or who could be telling that story? And then what visual would you use? And then finally, maybe you have a visualization in mind. And then what's the story? So I know each of you shared, like Maria, you shared the pictures of the faces, and Eric and Zach, you talked about changes over time, maybe in physical location to certain places. So what is there a story there and some data points that might complete what you shared in our community check-in? Okay, does that make sense? So when we're done, we'll get into a large group again, and then you can choose to, if you have something to share, we can turn over the privileges to you to share screen, or if you just want to talk through it, that's fine too. Okay, but this is the application part. So how are you going to think about putting it all together? Any questions before I put you into your group? And I know Zach has to leave in a little bit, so we'll get you started, and then we'll see Eric and Maria here in a little bit. Okay, so we'll give you about, you have about 20 minutes.
Hi there.
So we put a little time aside here for just hearing about what you talked about in your small group.
So ours was more, I feel like, one question leading to 4 questions, leading to 38 questions, then putting a story together. So we're both in small communities where things like the equity compass don't really work that well from my perspective. So I've had this on my mind for a while. We looked at Arapahoe County, which has over 500,000 people in the full county. And then just looked at like the far east census tract. The life expectancy was, I think, 82 years, right around 82.6. And it was 82.5% white in population. And then when we looked at some of the more metro parts of that county, one especially right north of 285, that life expectancy was down to 71 years from 82.6. So that jumped out to me as like a huge gap, especially for life expectancy. Like that's more than a decade. And then the next piece that I feel like I had questions on with that is when we looked at that more metro county, it was an almost even breakdown of like low 40% white population, and then around the same number for Hispanic Latino population. So that was kind of like what I would want to explore more is what are the other factors, what are the other variables to have a decade plus gap in life expectancy from parts of the same county that look to be about like a 30-minute drive from each other.
Well, and we had kind of come into it thinking that given like access to healthcare is not as prevalent out in the eastern part of the county, because they have a mobile clinic that they'll park at Byers, but then the other census tract that we looked at isn't really that far away from some of the biggest metro hospitals in the state. And so how is it that the Far East has better life expectancy than this metro area? And the other one was over by Ruby Hill. So it's an older community, overarching, like from historical standpoint, that's one of the more oldest communities in Denver. But how is it that there's that big discrepancy? And we talked a lot about like how close it is to like industry, whether or not maybe those were communities that were attracting an older population versus like young families because of the location to schools and parks. And so there's just more questions than we really had answers to, but I think that's probably the point of the exercise, right?
Yeah, totally. That's great.
And then one of the other things that we talked about was looking at over time, like a 50, 70 year collection of that data to see if those numbers have always been, a decade apart in life expectancy, or if they were closer, or if it was even a wider gap than that. And then to me, looking at those numbers, the question again would be like, what else? What are the other variables? What else has changed over that time? And I think we know a lot of it would be like population, industrialization, things like that look different today than they did 70 years ago.
You couldn't even, I always carry his groceries and everything up.
Maybe living right next to, like you mentioned, 35, next to a major thoroughfare. Those are great, and you're right, Maria. The point is to keep questioning, and you found something that was that created interest for you, right? Like you found something through some data. So that is part of your entry point into that circular model.
Right.
You're thinking about a visualization, like Eric, you're sharing, maybe it's a time-based visualization where through the exploration of these questions, is that gap in 10 years, or has it been more or less over time, to create a visualization? And then there's potentially some factors to look at, like what is it? That's a great question. Like, why is it out by buyers or on the Eastern Plains that expectancy is a little greater, right? So that's good. And I'm curious, maybe just with this last couple minutes of the large group, have you thought about how you might put the story all together within those small communities that you both live in or represent?
I feel like numbers and our community are always like the smallest point of how we tell our story. It's so much more the people who have generationally lived there. And that kind of goes with that. It's putting like a personal story on that change over time, rather than just looking at like that life expectancy change over time.
Yeah, and that can be data in and of itself, right? So
right,
the stories can also generate and serve multiple purposes. It doesn't necessarily have to be really hard statistical data, but yeah. So
right, and those stories I feel like can give so much context to the numbers, where we're coming up with all these questions, and if we were talking to someone, they might say, oh yeah, in 1983, that's when the big factory moved in down by the river, and then that brought different people to town because they were working there. And I just feel like the personal story does so much to add context to the raw numbers,
Yeah. So are you thinking of using this in any kind of context within your work? Like,
I don't know. I am actually switching jobs next month, and kind of got my head spinning on how this can work, because I'm going to cover all of Southwest Colorado in my next job. So there'll be way more, numbers, data, way more human context. So I think stuff like this could be really valuable, where I'm seeing a lot of issues trying to work with any version of data in a community of a couple hundred.
All right, well, good, Eric. I'm glad the wheels are still turning. It sounds like you enjoy that storytelling aspect too, or the getting people's stories. So that might be your entry point once you build relationships and get around to the different communities, and then maybe the other pieces will appear from that entry point. Yeah.
Right.
How about you, Maria?
Well, having looked at Arapahoe County, and it actually abuts the county I live in, and isn't really super far from Yuma County in the grand scheme of Colorado's distances. I was kind of interested in maybe asking our CTC person that's over in the Bennett Byers area, what she sees, because it's interesting to me. I haven't compared like Yuma to that particular census tract. There's 2 census tracts in Yuma. Yuma has 2 hospitals, but I don't believe that the census tract that we were looking at on the Eastern Plains of Arapahoe has a hospital at all. And so that would be an interesting comparison to see, like, what is it that that they have that's like working out there, that, you know, is there something that we're missing, that maybe our community could have too, as a very small rural community. And I guess also just knowing that our whole health district 1, which is my entire Northeast Colorado Health Department, can covers all of Health District 1, which is the far northeast corner. We have a really big problem with data suppression and not having people participating in surveys, or at least not having them represented in surveys. And so the question to me is, like, how can we get them involved? Why aren't they being involved? And how can we, like, make sure that our community is better represented in the state? Because I think there's a lot of stories out here that aren't being told too, that we have a lot of historical families. We have a lot of centennial farms out here. And so you have families that have lived here for centuries, literally. And what are their stories? They've seen a lot of change, and some of that change is actually being published in our local newspaper about how the town has evolved from, you know, the 40s to now. And knowing that health part of it would be really fascinating, because at one point there were a lot more doctors and dentists in the community, and now we don't have a hospital in the county I live in. And so how has that impacted people, and how do they feel like it's changed their stories?
That's great. And you're both on a great track, and I would say you're right where you need to be, and asking questions is the first step. You know, continually asking questions, because that's getting into that research mindset. I'll turn it over to Alina, who's gonna close us out here. And thank you both for that.
Yeah, thank you. I know we only have a couple of minutes, so I may go through these a little bit quickly. I'm just going to stop. Okay, so I know we've gone through during this series around how to kind of create the data story. So we just have a couple of previews for what you might do with it after you do have a story and you want to find where to share that. So these are a few quick points that I will go through. You may determine that your story is best fit as a short form, which can be really impactful, and they really need to have a clear message. So this might be something like a quick video, a blog, or an infographic. Just make sure that you have a message that showcases the key points of your data well. And this, even though it's short, it still needs to have a kind of beginning, middle, and end to your story. The end can be open-ended in some ways, you know, there's always follow-up opportunities, but at least for the time being. With complexity and length, there's often a lot more nuance. So if you do determine that your story should be longer, has multiple parts to it, you want to make sure that each piece of detail adds to the moves and the message, like kind of helps to develop your message more. It's not just drawn out or kind of extra fluff that you don't need. So this might look like podcasts or documentary video, articles, or maybe even a flip book. We were talking earlier about something like that, where you have that kind of images over time, almost thinking about, what would that look like as a flip book was somewhere my mind went. Consider that a lot of the stories do require resources. So time, cost, skill, and energy is required to put these in. And I think that's something we've impressed a lot during this series, especially if we're doing it with community centered. So be realistic with your timelines and your skills and your ability to do this work. And if you can, have partners in it as well to help make your story is really helpful. And then also just consider how your target audience will access the story. So we talked a bit about language earlier. Also thinking about the medium, if folks don't have a lot of internet access or don't have a lot of smartphones, videos might not be the best kind of way to share that information. So those are just a quick few tips. I will kind of go through quickly. These are just refreshers around those questions that we've talked about time and time again throughout this series, using an equity lens when we're talking about taking those stories and actually putting it into action. So you have those here. I did just want to preview for you all. There is some functionality already up on the website around this. And we may have talked about it in an earlier session, but there is a call to action tool that's linked up to each of the counties and has unique data for those. So that's where you can find stories. It's kind of nested within the Equity Data Navigator right now. But we've also, within the past couple of weeks, added in additional resources there, including partners in the areas. So there are a number of Colorado-wide partners working around social determinant of health areas. So we've kind of listed out the areas of focus that they have. But then there are also place-based ones that are included in there as well. Kind of similar to the data that we've seen before. There are limitations. There will be more resources or more partners within large metro areas as opposed to our rural areas, but that's not to say that the rural areas don't have their own. So we're in the process of building that out more, adding more partners to it. If you have any folks that you are thinking about, we would welcome you to kind of send their information over as a way for folks to continue to connect with those partners around them. And then we're also looking at including links to, or maybe an embed around Common Cause. So I don't know if anyone has used that, but it's a nice way to find your representatives in your area. Let me see if I can just pop the link in the chat. I think this should take you there. So yeah, we're looking at incorporating that as well. And it's a really nice way to figure out where to take your story next so that it can have the maximum impact and maybe start to change some of those policies that are not in support of health equity or of community. So that's exciting stuff we've got coming up. And I think we did a little bit of reflection already with Scott, and I know we're at time. There is a Menti if you would like to include some reflections on what you plan to do with this information during this session. And then we have the usual, the takeaways and the thank you for joining us. So I'll leave that up just because I know we're at time, and I really appreciate you all sticking it out with us and joining us week after week. It's been really wonderful to hear from each of you, your stories and kind of the things that you're facing and what you found helpful and what are the limitations that we know are part of CEC, but you help to illuminate those as well. So yeah, thank you, Scott. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, just thank you so much. And thank you to Lucia for joining us and for the translation. And thank you to both of you for being with us for such a long time. And we hope that you will take this into your work.
Sounds good. Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.
All
Thank
right.
you. You
Good luck
too.
with your job, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.